He arrived in the bustle of King's Landing, his carriage rolling to a halt in front of the Red Keep under the relentless southern sun. Eddard Stark stepped out with the weight of the North still upon his shoulders, leaving behind the crisp chill of Winterfell for this teeming city of intrigue. The Lannisters' gold, the Tyrells' roses, the Martells' simmering resentments. Ned was no fool. He knew that the capital was a nest of vipers, though he had yet to discover the true cunning of one among them. Peter Baelish, called Littlefinger. That slight man stood by, quietly smiling, seemingly no more than a helpful counselor with a sly tongue, a teacher of brothels and coin. But as the new hand of the king emerged from his carriage, Littlefinger watched him with eyes that weighed every possibility. From that very first day, Ned saw the city in disrepair. The crown was in debt, the king was drunk on leisure and memory, the small council bickered in polite, measured phrases. The day he arrived, Ned was escorted through the castle corridors by none other than Lord Peter Baelish himself. Baelish walked with a certain bounce, a bit of swagger that belied his small stature. He pointed out the halls, the chambers, the best routes to meet the king, and behind each of his careful gestures and pleasant remarks lay a labyrinth of ambition. To Ned, it all seemed trivial. He had come to serve his hand, to uncover the truth behind Jon Arryn's untimely death, and to keep his friend King Robert safe. Unbeknownst to him, Peter had an entirely different script in mind. For Littlefinger, Ned's arrival was another move on a wide, uncharted board. Each piece could be nudged toward chaos or order as Peter chose, so long as he alone remained the invisible puppet master. He greeted Lord Stark with a show of old familiarity, conjuring memories of Catelyn Tully, whom Ned had married, and subtly reminding the new hand that Littlefinger once had a youthful infatuation with her. It was only a short conversation, but within it Peter gleaned the entire shape of Ned's honorable character. He saw the steel in the man's eyes, the moral uprightness that would sooner break than bend. He smirked inwardly. This was the perfect challenge. Eddard Stark was a fortress of integrity, but fortresses can be taken from within. When they arrived in the solar where the king awaited, Robert Baratheon was all booming laughter and hearty slaps on the shoulder. Ned tried to keep his face neutral as he looked upon the man who had once been such a fearsome warrior. Robert had grown corpulent, wearing his power like ill-fitting garments. He poured wine while Ned attempted to maintain the courtesy due a king. Robert talked of a grand tourney, of revels and feasts to celebrate the new hand's arrival. Ned tried to protest the expense gently at first. Then Robert's mood darkened momentarily, and Baelish stepped in, reassuring the king that the crown's finances would be handled. By him, of course. Ned should have paid more mind to that, but he was still new to the capital's intrigues. He still believed honesty could fix what was broken, so he let it pass. Littlefinger spent the evening calibrating his approach. He knew Ned Stark would want to investigate Jon Arryn's death. He also knew exactly where the trail would lead. The bastard children, the matter of inheritance, the Lannister secret. But Peter didn't mind. Each bit of knowledge gleaned by Ned Stark was another step deeper into a pit that Littlefinger could manipulate. That very night, Peter visited several quiet corners of King's Landing. His first stop was a modest brothel he owned under a false name, where he kept a discreet ledger detailing coin flows and discreet services. There he arranged for a trusted spy to keep an eye on Ned's men, especially Jory Castle and the other loyal swords from the north. Then he made his way to a seedy wine sink in Flea Bottom, where a cunning boy named Kella whispered rumors drifting around the city. He took note of what the gold cloaks muttered about, whether the Lannisters had any new schemes in motion, and where Varys the spider had put his little birds. All of this Peter filed away behind a cordial smile. Ned Stark might soon learn the capital's secrets, but only after Peter had positioned himself to profit. In the coming days, the new hand took up the seat on the small council. He was appalled to discover how deeply in debt the crown was, not only to the Lannisters but also to the Iron Bank of Bravos. Littlefinger, as master of coin, presented the ledgers with a helpful manner. He glossed over certain details, highlighting others, never quite lying but obscuring enough to keep Ned guessing. He balanced Robert's extravagances by borrowing from the Lannisters, thereby forging a yoke of gold around the king's neck. Lord Stark insisted on curbing expenses, but every time he approached Robert, the king roared that a bit of gold was needed for a new feast, or to fund the next grand gesture. Peter watched the tension build with quiet satisfaction. Each argument between Robert and Ned was a fray in the rope holding the realm together. Littlefinger enjoyed plucking at those frays. One of the earliest things Ned did as hand was to visit the brothel where Robert's bastard child lived. He brought Jory Castle and a few other men with him. Ned wanted to see the girl's resemblance to the king, to confirm what Jon Arryn had discovered. But of course, word reached Littlefinger first. Baelish knew the significance of Ned's search. He rode along with the unsuspecting Ned, feigning a helpful guide. In truth, Peter had arranged to have eyes on them the whole way, men who would note everyone Ned spoke to. By the time they reached the small, innocuous building, Peter was already imagining how to spin this knowledge. He decided he would let Ned see what he needed to see, just enough to push him further along the path. When they arrived, Littlefinger quietly ducked out of the main room, letting Ned behold the living proof of Robert's philandering. The child's black hair was a copy of the Baratheon line, a stark contrast to the golden-haired Lannisters. Ned's expression was grim. He looked to Peter, who only shrugged, as though to say, "It's not my secret to tell." All the while, Baelish observed the swirl of palace politics. Cersei Lannister glided through the halls in her regal dresses, suspicious of everyone, determined to protect her children's claim to the throne. Jaime Lannister hovered near the king, making jests and flirting with courtiers, but always watchful for a chance to eliminate threats. And then there was Varys, the spymaster, as subtle in his manipulations as Peter was. The two men shared a strange camaraderie, rivals in the great game, yet united in the belief that knowledge was power. Each day, Peter tested Varys's defenses, traded barbs at the small council, and gleaned small morsels of information. Sometimes he planted false leads to see which would trickle back to him. In that labyrinth, Eddard Stark was a wide-eyed traveler with too much honor, an easy mark for both men. Peter just had to move slowly, so as not to alert the spider too soon. Then came the news that Tyrion Lannister had been taken by Catelyn Stark in the Vale. Suddenly, the entire realm was on edge. The imp was a Lannister, and his capture threatened to spark war between the North and the West. Ned Stark was furious with his wife for acting without consulting him, but at the same time he quietly believed it might be the key to unearthing the truth about Jon Arryn. With Tyrion in her grasp, Cat might confirm the Lannisters' involvement. Littlefinger, meanwhile, saw an exquisite opportunity. War threatened the stability of the Seven Kingdoms, and from chaos, Peter could ascend. He turned to his private network of informants, funneling bits of information to both sides. He spoke carefully to Ned, never lying outright, but offering to mediate with the Lannisters, to smooth things over if possible. He whispered to the Lannisters that Ned was on the verge of uncovering their secret regarding the royal lineage. He placed himself as an indispensable go-between, the only man who could maintain some semblance of diplomacy. When the gold cloaks began to stand watch at the city gates in greater numbers, Ned suspected the Lannisters were preparing for a violent confrontation if Tyrion wasn't released. Baelish, behind that unassuming half-smile, pushed the tension forward. He offered Ned a gentle push. "I can help you, my lord, if only you'd trust me," while dropping subtle hints that the Lannisters would not hesitate to kill if they felt cornered. Ned, uncomfortable with deception, preferred to try reason and directness, which only served Littlefinger's plan more. The more honorable Ned acted, the more easily he could be cornered. Soon after, an altercation erupted between Ned's men and Jaime Lannister in the streets of King's Landing. Jory Castle was killed. Ned was nearly slain himself, only saved by the crowd that intervened, halting Jaime from delivering a mortal blow. This was precisely the sort of chaos Peter thrived upon. In the aftermath, the city was abuzz with fear. Ned convalesced in a bed, his leg injured, while the Lannisters seethed for vengeance on Catelyn for abducting Tyrion. Peter visited Ned's bedside, expressing sympathy for Jory's death. He brought a sweet cordial, urging the hand to recover swiftly, all the while sowing seeds of doubt. He fed Ned's anger at the Lannisters but also offered to broker peace. The entire scene was choreographed in Peter's mind, from the moment he walked in until he left Ned to his troubled thoughts. By now, Baelish had begun planting the suspicion in Ned that Robert's heirs might not be Robert's children. He gave no direct evidence, only breadcrumbs, but Ned was following them all the same. As the days passed, Ned grew more certain that Cersei's children were fathered by Jaime. This was the damning truth that had likely led Jon Arryn to his end. Quietly, Ned began to plan how to expose Cersei, how to warn Robert, and how to keep the realm from falling into a civil war. He confided in Peter, or so he thought. He told Baelish that if the king died, Stannis Baratheon was the rightful heir, not the product of incest that sat on the throne in the form of Joffrey. Peter nodded, feigning acceptance of the logic, but in his heart he was gleeful. He would not allow the kingdom to fall under the rule of dour, humorless Stannis. That was not the route to power. Peter needed chaos, the sort that breaks kingdoms and forges new alliances. It was not long before the moment arrived that changed everything. King Robert decided to go on a hunt, a grand expedition of boar-spearing in the Kingswood, accompanied by his retinue. Ned remained behind, still healing from his leg wound. While Robert drank himself deeper into oblivion out in the forest, the capital simmered. Peter kept to the Red Keep, forging alliances, ensuring the Gold Cloak's loyalty. He knew that if any hand was to guide the next outcome, it would be the City Watch. Janos Slynt was a man who valued coin above all else, and so Peter made sure to pay him handsomely. Over drinks, Peter offered compliments, promised more gold. He knew Ned Stark would count on the Gold Cloaks to protect him in a crisis, but Littlefinger planned a different fate. When the fateful boar gored King Robert, the realm was thrown into uncertainty. Robert was carried back, delirious and dying, muttering for Ned to protect the realm. In that moment of hush around the king's deathbed, Ned wrote out Robert's last wishes, naming Ned as protector of the realm until Joffrey came of age. Cersei was there, haughty and cold, though her eyes flickered with a faint worry. Ned's hand trembled as he signed the parchment for Robert, though he carefully avoided writing Joffrey as the rightful heir, instead referencing the rightful heir in vague language. In the corridor outside, Baelish leaned against the wall, as calm as a cat. He offered Ned a well-meaning smile. "I shall support you, my lord, as I always have." Ned took him at his word, though uncertain. Meanwhile, Cersei walked out of that bedchamber already convinced that she would have to move swiftly against Ned. The next day, Robert passed. The hush that fell over King's Landing was like the still air before a storm. Ned, standing in the council chamber, insisted that Stannis was the rightful heir. But Cersei refused to accept that, brandishing the king's last will. She had seized the paper and torn it, not caring for its legality. Then she proclaimed Joffrey as king. Ned tried to resist, but Peter placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Leave it to me, my lord Hand," he whispered. "I'll secure the City Watch. We'll keep the queen from interfering until Stannis can be summoned." Ned hesitated. He had no one else to trust. His men were outnumbered. So he nodded, never dreaming how thoroughly Baelish had subverted the Watch. The moment came in the throne room, with Cersei and Joffrey flanked by Lannister guards. Ned marched in, letter in hand, flanked by his loyal household guard. He announced the rightful king, Stannis, and demanded that the City Watch arrest Cersei and her children. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Then the Gold Cloaks turned their cloaks, literally pivoting to face Ned's men. Swords were drawn. In the clash, Ned's men were cut down, blood running across the marble floor. Janos Slynt spat at Ned's feet, and Littlefinger, stepping forward, pressed a dagger to Ned's throat. "I told you not to trust me," he said with a cool smile. The shock in Ned's eyes was matched only by the heartbreak of betrayal. Ned was seized, marched to the dungeons. The Northmen in the city tried to rally, but they were hopelessly outnumbered by the Gold Cloaks and Lannister guards. Peter made sure the city was locked down, with no ravens allowed to fly to Stannis. He demanded that the City Watch keep the peace. He soothed lords who felt uneasy about the bloodshed, telling them that Ned Stark had tried to stage a coup. He assured them the realm would remain stable under King Joffrey, and that none needed to fear so long as they remained loyal. Behind the scenes, of course, he was counting coins, forging new alliances, and preparing for the next phase. He was no Lannister lapdog. He simply used them as he used everyone else. In the days that followed, Sansa Stark pleaded for her father's life. She wrote letters to Robb in Winterfell urging him not to rise in rebellion. Cersei seemed inclined to find a peaceful solution. If Ned would confess treason, perhaps he could take the black. Littlefinger, however, knew that a living Ned Stark would remain a symbol for the North, a risk to the Lannisters' hold on power. And as the seeds of war were already sprouting in the Riverlands, Tywin Lannister rallying men, Bolton men stirring in the north, Peter saw advantage in the realm fracturing. A living Ned might become a rallying cry. If Ned were dead, Peter could harvest the chaos more freely. He whispered advice into Cersei's ear, that Ned was too honorable, too dangerous to leave alive. Joffrey needed a gesture of strength to keep the realm in check. If Ned were pardoned, the king would be seen as weak. Better to make an example of him. At the same time, Baelish confided to Varys that letting Ned live might be wise, so that the North could be pacified. He feigned uncertainty, sowing confusion among his rivals, but the truth was that Peter intended to see Ned's head on a spike. He wanted the chaos that would erupt from Robb Stark's vengeful response. War would tear the realm to pieces. Peter hoped to pick up those pieces. When the day arrived, they dragged Ned from the Black Cells to the steps of the Great September of Baelor, where Joffrey sat enthroned, the High Septon presiding. The crowd pressed close. Sansa wept, her face pale with fear, while Arya slipped unseen among the onlookers. Ned, forced to kneel, gave a public confession of treason, spitting out the words only because he believed it would spare his daughters. He admitted to plotting against the rightful king, forging alliances with Stannis, or so the script went. The hush in the crowd was broken by a shrill caw of gulls overhead. Littlefinger stood near the dais, arms folded, face grave, as though sorrowed by this turn of events. If anyone bothered to notice, they might have seen the faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Joffrey, flush with new power, declared that mercy was for traitors, and without waiting for his mother's counsel, he ordered the execution of Ned Stark. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Cersei tried to intervene. Sansa shrieked for mercy, but the king's order rang out. Island Payne, the royal headsman, swung the greatsword Ice, Ned's own family sword, seized for the crown's use. The blade glittered in the southern sun. In a single sweep, Eddard Stark's head was separated from his body. Collective gasp erupted, then a hush, then roars and cries. Sansa fainted, while Arya vanished in the chaos, possibly saved by a kindly member of the Night's Watch in the crowd. The scene was etched in blood and horror. Littlefinger watched, impassive. He would pretend shock and sorrow later if asked, but for now he studied the reaction. The fear in the crowd was tangible. Many of the gathered lords wore expressions of dismay. But Peter saw an opportunity. With Ned gone, the North would rally behind Robb Stark or some other claimant, and war would ignite across the land. Peter's own position at court would be all the more crucial. Cersei would rely on him to keep the gold flowing and the city calm. And in this time of confusion, it would be Peter who shaped the narrative. He could blame the entire fiasco on Joffrey's petulance, on Ned's stubbornness, on whatever story best served him in the moment. And so he stood there, shoulders back, chest out, a faint smile ghosting his lips. He had orchestrated it masterfully. From the moment Ned arrived in the capital, Peter had planted seeds of half-truths, misdirected him, set him upon a path guaranteed to end in ruin. He ensured that Ned discovered the secret of Cersei's children, but without the power to use it effectively. He lured Ned into trusting him at the final confrontation, knowing exactly how and when to betray him. And then, once Ned was captive, he used every whisper and rumor to push the Lannisters into demanding blood. A living Ned might have complicated matters too much, might have forced compromises that would keep the realm from descending into war. But a dead Ned was a spark that would set the entire countryside aflame. After the execution, Peter retreated to his favorite brothel, one with red curtains and perfumed corridors, to watch the city from a high window. The small folk were in an uproar, cursing the Lannisters, lamenting the loss of the honorable Ned Stark. They marched in ragged lines, some demanding justice, others chanting for the king. Riots threatened to break out. Peter arranged to have gold distributed to the right pockets. A few of the city watch, a few sellswords, and some key provocateurs in the streets. He wanted the tension stoked, but not so much that it overturned the city. Just enough to keep people fearful and to keep the Lannisters reliant on him. As night fell, he could hear the distant clamor of fists on wooden doors, the moans of mourning women, and the squeals of petty thieves taking advantage of the chaos. It was a symphony to him, a tune of discord from which he would profit.